prazer enorme receber o professor Noam Zion, contar para vocês de maneira bem resumida a história desse encontro. No ano passado, a comunidade Shalom e a CIP, em conjunto, conseguiram realizar um projeto importante, que é a versão brasileira da Haggadah, a Laila Azeh, que está à disposição para vocês nas duas comunidades, para aquisição, para enriquecer o ceder de vocês, uma Haggadah muito especial. E sobre a Haggadah, nós falaremos mais no dia 20 de março, na comunidade Shalom, e no dia 21 de março, aqui na CIP, às 19h30. Então, o professor estará conosco novamente no dia 20 de março e 21 de março, na Shalom e na CIP, às 19h30, para falarmos da Haggadah, e ele vai ensinar a gente como usar bem a Haggadah e como enriquecer a experiência do nosso ceder de Pesach. A Haggadah é feita de tal maneira que nós podemos extrair dela um ceder mais próximo para crianças pequenas, um ceder mais próximo para adolescentes, um ceder mais próximo para adultos. Sabendo usar bem essa Haggadah, o ceder pode ser extremamente convidativo e interessante. E ele vai nos ajudar a trabalhar com a Haggadah que ele criou nesses 2 dias. Então vale a pena vocês participarem do workshop. As duas comunidades estão divulgando isso. Mandem um e-mail confirmando. No caso da CIP, o e-mail é pesach@cip.org.br. Em relação a hoje, nós vamos conversar um pouco sobre os 70 anos da Declaração Universal dos Direitos Humanos, em especial sobre a raiz judaica dessa declaração. De que maneira as fontes judaicas inspiram a Declaração Universal dos Direitos Humanos. E amanhã, na comunidade Shalom, nós vamos escutar sobre os 70 anos de Israel. Então, hoje, 70 anos da Declaração Universal, amanhã, 70 anos de Israel. E não por acaso, esses dois assuntos, eles estão profundamente conectados, não somente porque os dois são produto da Organização das Nações Unidas, da ONU, mas também são uma resposta, de alguma maneira, da ONU à Shoah, ao Holocausto, à Segunda Guerra Mundial. Tanto a criação do Estado de Israel como a Declaração Universal dos Direitos Humanos se conectam com o que estava acontecendo naquele momento pós-guerra. Então, hoje vamos ouvir sobre 70 anos dos direitos humanos, amanhã, 70 anos de Israel, na comunidade Shalom. Adriano, posso convidar todos? Estão todos convidados para estarem lá conosco, também às 19h30. Toda Rabá.
Okay. So my name is Noam Zion. I live in Yerushalayim, and I'm very, very happy to be here at the CP and at Shalom. And you're wonderful hosts, both of your communities. And I'm really amazed at what wonderful people you get to volunteer in your synagogues. I was really impressed with the very high quality of commitment, of professional skills, really amazing. Now, for the sake of not using up too much paper, we have one for every 2. So some of the people who just came in, if you could sit with some of the other people who are here in front, then you can share the paper, and so that'll be good for ecology in general. First of all, I think it's a wonderful and interesting idea that you came up with, that Michelle and Adrian came up with, that we're going to do 2 talks. First, a talk about 70 years ago and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And then the next night, we're going to do 70 years ago and the United Nations recognition of the State of Israel and of the partition program. And so it all goes back to the year that I was born in 1948. And it's really interesting to think about these 2 different sides of the United Nations, 2 different sides of principles of democracy, both the democracy for the Jewish state and for other countries and other nations, each one to have its own nation state, its own independence, its own culture, and at the same time to be concerned with human rights. So for a moment, let's think about how those are 2 different notions. Even though the United Nations, it's called the United Nations, it's not the united individuals. It's not made up of every individual in the world who's a direct member. You have to be a member of the United Nations through a nation. And the basic idea of the United Nations, going back to the League of Nations in 1920, right after World War I, was that the world would no longer be a world based on empires, where within an empire you have many different national and religious groups that are mixed together, usually under a tyrant, or at least under a king, that after World War I, we would get rid of those empires. We got rid of the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the smaller German Empire, but we still had the French Empire and the British Empire, and we still had, America didn't have its empire in the same kind of a way. But after World War II, there was a move towards the breakdown of also the British Empire collapsed. The French Empire, they continued to fight in North Africa and in Vietnam, but gradually all those empires collapsed. It was the end of colonialism. In Africa, it took another 20 years, but the United Nations today it's more than 200 nations. Now, what's the basic idea of the League of Nations and the United Nations? That each ethnic group, each group with its own language, its own culture, sometimes its own religion, wants to have self-determination as a group. And they want their country to be specifically reflect their own values. However, at the same time, as you emphasize that not I, but us, we as a group can determine what the public sphere should be. We want a Jewish public sphere, a Hebrew public sphere, just as in Brazil they want a Portuguese one with Portuguese culture. Now, many people can be members of Brazil, but Brazil's public culture is specifically Portuguese in some kind of way with the history of Brazil's development, right? Israel is the same way. But at the same time, what happens to the minorities, minority cultures, minority nations, individuals within these countries, right? What happens to their rights? And very often there is a conflict between these two values. Because if I emphasize that Israel is for Jews, or I emphasize that, then where does that leave the Arabs who are there? And if I want to emphasize a certain set of public values, where does it leave the individuals? The notion of human rights is the notion that each individual has their own self-determination. They have their own freedom as individuals. And the state, even if the state is a state of a certain nation, they have to give rights to the minorities and to the individuals. Those things are in tension. They're in tension because an important principle of autonomy, an important principle of the United Nations is we do not interfere in the internal affairs of another country. We respect each country works out their own internal government, and of course we want peace between the nations. But the notion of human rights says the opposite. The notion of human rights said, I'm going to tell you in your country that you are not treating your own citizens properly. You're not treating the minorities properly. You're not treating the individuals properly. So the human rights movement and the national rights movement have a deep tension, even though they go right back to the United Nations. It's two different notions of democracy. There's democracy, which is concerned about the majority can express their own values. The majority should rule the country by what the majority thinks. And the other aspect of democracy is that each individual's private rights, their freedoms have to be protected from the majority, from the tyranny of the majority, from the state. That's part of the tension. So what we're going to talk about tomorrow at Shalom is we're going to talk about Israel and the issue having being both a democracy and a Jewish democracy, and how do we make it a Jewish state and still have democracy? How those two things go together. And tonight, we're going to talk about the development of human rights as a value, as an ideal within the United Nations, and how it grew, and how today there's a major crisis having to do with human rights, which is caused by the enormous number of economic refugees coming out of Afghanistan, out of Syria, out of all over Africa. And that's a challenge to the notion of human rights, because some of those refugees cross state lines. They go from one continent to the other. Do the other countries that want to be Jewish, that want to be German, that want to be Hungarian, that want to be whatever they are, do they have to accept all of these foreign economic refugees or not? And if they do, what will happen to their desire to have their own particular national culture? It's not so obvious. There's many tensions. Europe is, with the last elections in Europe, you can see how much tension there is in Europe. There's a big move in Europe towards the right as a result, partly, of the fact that they feel threatened by these immigrants. So sometimes your concern for human rights gets in the way of your desire as the majority to create your own national culture. Okay. Let's start in the following. I think I'll give you the big theory, and then we'll go piece by piece. The big theory is as follows, that the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 involved, I think, it involved 4 different revolutions. We'll talk about each one of them. The first revolution is that we're not talking about civil rights, we're talking about human rights. Civil rights, civil from the word city or from society, means that everybody in a country should have the same equal rights. Of course, Martin Luther King in the United States was concerned that the black American citizens did not have equal civil rights. It was the civil rights movement. It wasn't the human rights notion. He was not struggling for equal rights in America of all people who live all over the world. When Obama came up with the idea of health insurance that exists for almost every other country I can think of, but America is very backward. He called it universal health insurance. Universal means the whole world, but not for Obama. He meant universal for all American citizens. Civil rights is about the rights of the people within a society, but human rights is about the rights of human beings anywhere in the world. That's the first revolution, to move from civil rights to human rights. The second revolution here is there is a right to be left alone. A right, you don't bother me. I have my private space. You can't coerce me. We talk about that as the freedom from interference, the freedom from tyranny, the freedom from pressure. There is a notion of rights as negative rights, I call them, rights to freedom from interference. But the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights had another notion of rights, positive rights. The positive right to express myself, the positive right to get an education, the positive right to express my religion and my culture and my language. Now, the right to express yourself requires not just that people don't interfere with you, freedom of the press, freedom of opinion, freedom of consciousness, but it also requires money. It requires positive abilities to express yourself. If you want to create your own educational system, you need money for it. If you want to have your own radio station, then you're going to have to find money for that. So what the United Nations Declaration says is that human beings need not only to be left alone, human beings need the basic resources to support themselves and to support their culture and to be able to grow and flourish and become fully human, and that requires resources. So they're going to talk about the right a person has to work, the right to make a good living. Those are all questions of resources. It's not just letting people be free. It's also transforming, giving them the power and the resources. Now, where are those resources going to come from? Right? Who's going to support the individuals who would like to be able to go to school, teach, do culture, come from other countries into your country, and then be able to be accepted into health insurance? So the next revolution in the Human Rights Declaration is that it's not just a question of your rights, it's also a question of duties. We cannot have a society in which we simply list, these are all your rights, unless you have people who say, well, I will take upon myself the duty of providing you with your rights and providing you the resources you need. So that's part of that revolution, the relationship between rights and duties. That's a problem, I think, in our society, that most societies emphasize my rights. They don't emphasize so much my duties. And that's a problem. at least in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, the last thing is everybody has duties. But most of the declaration is about all the rights we have. Only a small part is about duties. I think maybe that has to be rebalanced, but that's fine. And the last revolution, which I said before, is the revolution that not only with human rights do you have a duty. You have a duty not only within your own country to worry about equal civil rights, but you have a duty to interfere with other countries. For example, when you had tens of thousands of Jews all over the world protesting that Natan Sharansky, who was a citizen of the Soviet Union, should be let out of prison and allowed to leave Russia, the Soviets said, it's none of your business. It's an internal affair. But hundreds of thousands of people said, no, it's not an internal affair. It's a matter of human rights, and every human being should be involved in protesting in one way or another for the right of Natan Sharansky, and in the end, 2 million Soviet Jews to leave the Soviet Union. The same thing was true, of course, of Nelson Mandela and of the Africans and the coloreds living in South Africa. There was an international movement to intervene in South African government and to tell them that they were violating human rights. That's a revolutionary notion. Okay. Now, the way human rights works, for the most part, is the result of certain individuals who are willing to be courageous enough to demand human rights and to demand that other people give human rights to other people. There aren't a lot of people like that. They have to be willing to commit themselves for years and years to struggle for human rights. They have to put their own lives on the line. They have to be activists. They have to convince hundreds of thousands of people that they should be involved in this project. And if we don't have those individuals, the Nelson Mandela and the Natan Sharansky, but also the people who are protesting, there will be no human rights. The Declaration of Human Rights sounds very nice, but it's only an aspiration. It's only an ideal. It's not a reality. They didn't say it was a reality. They said we should aspire to a standard of human rights for all the world. We aspire to it, but we don't have it. It's not a right. There's nobody to enforce it. Most of the ideals of the United Nations, there's nobody to enforce. It takes organizations, grassroots organizations of individuals usually, to create the pressure on the governments to make the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights come and become a reality. One of those people is not me, but it was my father. And my father was not a great hero, but whenever there was a movement, he would join it as a little person and join the movement. My children call my father, they call him, he's the Forrest Gump of the 20th century. Every time there's a movement, he's not the hero, but he helps. So in World War II, in which they were fighting against Japanese and the Nazis, my father was fighting in Okinawa. And afterwards, as soon as he got out of the army, he went to Israel in 1948 to fight for the state of Israel in the Haganah, along with my mother, who was also in the Haganah. And when in 1963, living in the United States, my father watched on television Martin Luther King struggling for civil rights and human rights in Birmingham, Alabama, my father and a small group of conservative rabbis went there to demonstrate. In fact, my father bought me there a very, very tiny button. And the button was a button that Martin Luther King's supporters were selling for $1 in order to support the movement. And the little button said, "I believe in human dignity." So my father wanted to buy the button. So he went to one of the black students who was selling the buttons and, "I want to buy that button." And he said to my father, "But do you believe in human dignity?" And my father, who always as a rabbi played around, he said, "I'm not sure I believe in human dignity." He said, "Then I'm not going to sell you the button. You can't wear that button unless you believe in human dignity. In the end, my father convinced him and he bought this little button. But even in the civil rights movement, human dignity and citizenship went together. And in the 1970s, my father became very active in the Soviet Jewry movement in America, bringing Congressman and the Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey, to have telephone conversations with the Soviet Jewish refuseniks. So that was my father, the Forrest Gump of human rights in the 20th century. But there's a person who's much closer to you, not from Brazil, but from Argentina. And I would like to ask Adrian to introduce him because I think he's a powerful example of what this human rights is about. Okay? This is Adrian's teacher, Marshall Meyer.
So we switched to Portuguese. Actually, Marshall was American, so I can continue in English. But the translation goes to Spanish and from Spanish to Portuguese. So Marshall fue uno de los grandes que durante la dictadura militar en Argentina, él enfrentó a los generales y él salvó judeos, ateos de todas las religiones, tornándose uno de los más importantes referentes en un momento bien complicado. Para quien no conhece, a ditadura argentina foi muito mais sanguinária que a brasileira, não comparando tours, mas eram diferentes. E ele explicava que ele fazia isso porque ele acreditava que a tradição judaica obrigava ele a ocupar-se disso. E quando as madres de Plaza de Maio, que são aquelas mulheres que perderam filhos que estavam desaparecidos, não encontravam espaço para ser acolhidas, ele hacía na sinagoga, que é a sinagoga onde ele é rabino, em Betel, e elas ficavam lá não porque acreditavam no judaísmo, elas não acreditavam no judaísmo, acreditavam cada um na sua fé, mas era o único espaço que eles tinham para isso. Então nós colocamos a história dele, para quem quiser se aprofundar, foi publicada em 2013, e o título é bastante sugestivo, Judaísmo, Direitos Humanos e Espiritualidade, a biografia intelectual do rabino Marshall Meyer, que foi publicada em 2013. Aqui na capa ele está com seu mentor e professor, Abraham Yeshua Heschel, os dois muito jovens. E claro que ele está... E eu queria apenas aproveitar e agradecer a Noam Zion, porque ele, um dos textos que nós colocamos na página 24 de nossa Haggadah, fala sobre o que significa ser um ativista. E ele explica um pouco a teoria de por que ele se tornou o que ele era. E ele explica assim: é a única forma de executar uma melodia na sinfonia da vida, que toca o leitmotiv da dignidade humana. Não tenho direito a permanecer em silêncio diante da injustiça. Não posso afirmar que creio em Deus e permanecer inativo quando a imagem divina é destruída. Quando a vida humana deixa de ser sagrada, perdemos nosso rumo na história e nos tornamos menos que humanos. Se quisermos garantir um processo democrático, se quisermos garantir uma sociedade democrática, devemos nos educar para responder às injustiças da nossa sociedade, devemos nos comprometer com o bem-estar de nossa polis em que vivemos, nossa cidade. Em síntese, devemos ser cidadãos responsáveis de nossa sociedade. Devemos estar dispostos a pensar e agir além das nossas próprios interesses pessoais.
Okay. I once did a book, besides the Haggadah, I did a book on Hanukkah. And to make Hanukkah contemporary, I said Hanukkah is about human courage. The courage, of course, of Judah the Maccabee. But then I collected as many as I could stories of contemporary profiles in Jewish courage. Marshall Meyer was one of those people in that list. Now, for the people who came in late and who don't have the text, Now is the test of whether you're willing to share your resources, because if you have two people with a text, if you could pass back the text to the people who don't have them, or they can move forward to sit next to somebody with a text, that would be very good. And we're going to start by reading the beginning of the preface to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And so for those of you who are at home and who don't have the text, I hope you'll be able to hear it properly. The first page, the very beginning, the preface.
A dignidade inerente a todos os membros da família humana e dos seus direitos iguais e inalienáveis constitui o fundamento da liberdade, da justiça e da paz no mundo. Considerando que o desprezo e o desrespeito pelos direitos humanos resultaram em atos bárbaros que ultrajaram a consciência da humanidade, e que o advento de um mundo em que mulheres e homens gozem de liberdade de expressão, de crença e da liberdade de viverem a salvo do temor e da necessidade, foi proclamado como a mais alta aspiração do ser humano comum, considerando ser essencial que os direitos humanos sejam protegidos pelo império da lei, para que o ser humano não seja compelido, como último recurso, à rebelião contra a tirania e a opressão. Agora, então, a Assembleia Geral proclama esta Declaração Universal dos Direitos Humanos como um padrão comum de conquista para todos os povos e todas as nações. Artigo 1. Todos os seres humanos nascem livres e iguais em dignidade e direitos. São dotados de razão e consciência e devem agir em relação uns aos outros com espírito de fraternidade.
Now, if you were at the United Nations in 1948, would you vote for this? Let's find out. Would you vote for what it says here? I see. We have a small number of people who are willing to vote. Okay. Remember, it's just a declaration. You don't have to do anything. You just have to declare that you're in favor of human rights. Okay? Thank you to the people who just came. We need to share with them some of the text. Could you sit next to people who have texts already? Because we don't have enough for everybody. Let's take a look at this preface at the beginning of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Part of the task that Rav Michel gave me was to talk about the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and also its connection with Jewish sources and Jewish traditions. If you read this preface, it's pretty hard to find anything that has to do with being Jewish. After all, isn't the point of this universal declaration for the whole world that it's not supposed to be a particular religion or a particular ideology? It's supposed to be broader than that. The intellectual sources in the preface don't mention Jewish things. What are the key elements here? The first thing is from the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and that is the notion of inalienable rights. Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So you have a reference to the creator in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Human Rights. Here we don't have a mention of the creator, but we're taking from that tradition. The second thing you have is you have something from John Locke, the notion of the right of revolution, that if people's human rights are not respected, that will lead to unrest and disorder, because then people can rebel against the government if the government is not providing human rights. That's taken from John Locke. John Locke was actually not only a political theorist in England, he was also a Christian Puritan theologian. So actually many of his notions, like the social contract, he took from the Bible. But on the surface, you don't see the religious background here. So the first source is the notion of the right and the freedoms of human beings. These are the negative freedoms, the inalienable rights to pursue your own life the way you want to. The second intellectual background here is the notion, they refer to the barbarous acts of World War II. World War II was very different than World War I. In World War I, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, but very few civilians were killed. World War II, 25 million civilians are killed, including, of course, the Jewish 6 million, but 25 million. It was a total war in which there was no real distinction between soldiers and between civilians. And of course, the barbarous acts went with a barbarous ideology. The ideology both of the Japanese and of course of the Nazis, which was a racist ideology that not only said the Jews should be destroyed, but said that these were the master race and they should rule over the Slavs, who they understood as being slaves, or over the Koreans, or over the Chinese if you were Japanese. So it's not just barbarous acts, it's a barbarous ideology, which is racist notion of slavery. That's his second major notion. Now, at the same time, of course, is the time of the Nuremberg Trials, in which, for the first time, you are trying Germans for their behavior towards other Germans. You're trying the German government and the people who worked for the German government for being involved in the genocide of the Jews. Therefore, one of the French Catholic jurists who was represented the French in the court of Nuremberg in 45 and 46, he invented a new term. The new term is crimes against humanity. So part of the birth of an ideology of human rights is a direct response to the birth of a notion of crimes against humanity. Because the truth is that the Germans, in the way they treated the Jews in Germany, were not violating any international laws. They were not violating any of the laws of war. They were simply how they treated their own citizens. So to say that we can judge people for how they treat their own citizens, that's part of that radical notion that there is human rights and that other human beings can interfere in the internal affairs and the internal ideology of the democratically elected Nazi regime. So that same notion of the background of that barbarism of World War II begins to move us strongly toward human rights. Again, not connected to Jewish things in any kind of a way. Then there is the notion of the four freedoms of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR in 1941 gave a very famous speech, the State of the Union, even before America entered into World War II, in which he talked about all human beings have a right to four freedoms. The most important freedom was the freedom from want, the freedom from economic needs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was talking at the end of the Depression in Germany and in France and in the United States that led ultimately in Germany to the rise of Nazism and of fascism in many different places throughout Europe. And he was saying that if we want to fight the battle of the Allies against the Japanese and especially against the Germans and the Italians, we need to fight a battle against poverty, against want, because the Depression leads to tyranny. It leads to fascism. So the Declaration of Human Rights takes that notion and it says that there's a human duty to provide every individual with their basic needs, not only because it's a nice idea for all human beings to be treated equally, but because if we don't do it, we will undermine the stability of our societies and will lead to radical solutions like, of course, what produced Nazism, both as an ideology. And the last thing they said that's important is that this is a common standard by which we should judge all countries. But notice, it's a standard we should judge countries by. It's not in fact a law. It's not what actually exists. As I said before, human rights in 1948 is not part of the status quo at all. It's an aspiration. Now, where's the part that's Jewish? Where's the part that's religious? So, in reading a wonderful book about the birth of human rights by Samuel Moyn, a Jew, of course, and a very fine historian of human rights, he helped me to understand the religious motivations of the Human Rights Declaration by looking at the people who actually put it together and wrote it. So you can see the names of some of the most important people. If you take a look at, let's see, where did I put the names? If you look at page 2 of your sources, if you don't have sources and you could come up and share, is there anybody who has 2 sources next to each other and you could pass some of them back? Or some of the people who are sitting alone could sit next to somebody who has them? Anybody willing to send another text back to the back? Thanks very much. So on page 2 you have at the very beginning, it talks about the creators of the Declaration of Human Rights. And it lists some of their names. It's important who they are. They are not politicians. They are private citizens. Many of them, though not all of them, are connected to either Catholic or strong Christian theologians, or they're Jews. And it's those 2 groups that had a big influence. One of the most interesting ones is Jacques Maritain. Jacques Maritain was a French Christian theologian who was a very strong fascist back in the 1920s. He was a member of the Action Française. He thought that Catholicism and democracy do not go together. And he was a very strong fascist. But he was married to a Jew. That always helps. And by the end of the 1930s, he became a very strong supporter of Zionism, a very strong supporter of democracy, a big opponent of fascism in France itself. And after the war was over, he's one of the major people leading to the writing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And he also has a very big influence on another man who was also active in this process. And his name was, let me see if I get, Angelo Roncalli. Anybody know who Angelo Roncalli is? The man who became Pope John the 23rd, and of course, forgave us for all of our sins of killing Christ. A little more extreme than that. He totally reinterpreted through the Vatican the understanding of the Jewish responsibility for the death of Christ. That was, again, the influence of Jacques Maritain on John Paul the 23rd that combined human rights and a total transformation in the Catholic attitude toward Judaism that come out of the same place. There were other people also equally involved from a Christian point of view. Now, let's take a look at one of the most important Jews involved. His name was René Cassin. He was an important jurist, a lawyer in France. He was persecuted, of course, by the Nazis during World War II. He was a strong supporter of Charles de Gaulle. Let's see what he has to tell us by looking at page 4. And if you look at page 4, where it says section 2, the 3 revolutions, and then under it, it says number 1, prologue of the Declaration of Human Rights. Could you read that again? Just that prologue, considerando.
Considerando que o reconhecimento da dignidade inerente e dos direitos iguais e inalienáveis de todos os membros da família humana é o fundamento da liberdade, da justiça e da paz no mundo.
I want you to pay attention to the term human family. That is a Jewish idea. It's a biblical idea. It is not at all the way that the Greeks used to think, or the Romans, or almost any other culture. The notion that all human beings are part of the human race, that everybody goes back to Adam and Eve, whatever their color, whatever their language, that's a very central Jewish ideal. And you can see how it influenced René Cassin. If you could keep reading, Dani, the next section about René Cassin. Beginning with the second paragraph. See where it says, a declarar.
A declaração deve basear os direitos universais sobre o grande princípio fundamental da unidade de todas as raças da humanidade. Um princípio que foi vergonhosamente violado na recente guerra. Nesse espírito, seu artigo 1 proclamou a unidade da família humana e ecoou os temas franceses da liberdade, da igualdade e da fraternidade. Todos os homens, sendo membros de uma família, são livres, possuem igual dignidade e direitos e devem considerar um ao outro como irmãos. A ideia da unidade da família humana remonta ao relato de origens de Gênesis, em que todos os seres humanos desceram de uma família criada à imagem de Deus e questiona conscientemente o racismo de Hitler. Cassan escreveu que o conceito de direitos humanos vem da Bíblia, dos 10 Mandamentos. Não devemos esquecer que o judaísmo deu ao mundo o conceito de direitos humanos. No entanto, eles foram redigidos em termos de deveres, que agora presumem direitos.
So, what you can see is the notion of human family and the notion that every human being is created in the image of God are for René Cassan the very opposite of the ideology of the Nazis, who denied that the Jews and Germans were part of the same family, who denied that Slavs and Germans were part of the same family. They included the British, right, as Aryans. They were willing to include the Americans. They certainly were not interested in including either Africans or Jews or Slavs in any kind of a way. So he sees that's the core idea, right? That's his powerful notion. Now, let's go back for a moment to where that comes from. If you look at the top of page 5, you will see a quotation about how God created all human beings in God's image. Notice men and women. That's pretty radical. That is not a notion of the Greeks. The Greeks gave us democracy, but they didn't give us a democracy that included women. They didn't give us a democracy that included barbarians who don't speak Greek. They did not include anybody who worked with his hands or who was a slave or who was a handler and did business. The Greeks had a very narrow notion of what a real human being was, and it certainly was not a general human notion. But the Jews had the notion that every human being, not only a Jew, is created in the image of God. Now, where did they get that idea from? They got that idea from the ancient Near East, from Babylonia, in which the kings, who were often considered in Babylonia the son of the god Marduk, was considered to be in the image of that god. It was only the king who was in the image of that god, because a god and a king are supposed to rule over rule. So only the king could be in the image of God because only the king rules the world. But what the Bible did, which was a radically democratic move, was to say that all human beings, men and women, are supposed to rule the world, to conquer the world, to collaborate together in creating and running the world that God created. And to do that, they had to be in the image of God so that they could rule the world in a creative, productive kind of a way. And it's that notion which is a part of the radical revolution here. That was continued in the days after the flood of Noah, in which God established, up until the days of Adam and Eve, human beings were all vegetarians. After Noah, God says, okay, if you want to eat meat, you can eat meat. Okay. But if you spill the blood of an animal, make sure to cover that blood, because the blood of an animal is very similar to the blood of a human being. And if you kill and spill the blood of a human being, then you are desecrating the image of God that all human beings were created in. So the notion that to be in the image of God makes you into a sacred character. Human life is sacred. And killing human life, any human life, is a source of desecration, shows you the deep integration within biblical traditions between the notion of God and the notion of the value of human beings. Again, this is radically different than the Darwinianism, and in general, the whole notions that were very, very powerful in the end of the 19th century and the 20th century of eugenics, that we could treat human beings as animals, and we could ask the question of what's a better quality animal or a less better quality. We can say those are the people who are not allowed to have intercourse and to have produce. We have to neuter them so they cannot have intercourse, so they will not produce substandard human beings. That whole notion that we're all part of this Darwinian struggle of animals allowed them to say, from a utilitarian point of view, who are the human beings who are worthwhile and who are the ones who aren't. But the notion of the image of God doesn't allow you to make any distinctions like that. All human beings, whatever their rational abilities, all human beings, whatever their religious values, are in the image of God. And I think that was one of the really important principles working here. Okay, let's take a next step. The next step is, what was the influence of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights on the world? 0. Why? Because 1948 was just very soon. It was near the beginning of the Cold War. And the most important question began, are you part of the free world or the communist world? Are you a socialist or are you a capitalist? And the battles between the American bloc of so-called free countries and of the Soviet bloc, which claimed to be also free countries, both of them claiming to be democratic, the whole battle between them was the most important question. Nobody worried about human rights when the biggest question was your country going to become communist or is it going to become Western? It's also still the period in which you have tens of countries who are still under French and British and empires, the colonial states that haven't gotten their independence yet. So this was a period in which human rights was something nice you could talk about. What was really important was what political group you belonged to, what bloc you were part of. When did that change? It changed really in the 1970s. The 1970s is the period of the great victory of what we call human rights. Sure if I find the right piece of page, okay. Yes, okay. Yeah, you have a page too, but where's my pages? Okay. Okay, we're gonna, I know. Okay, so what happens in the 1970s is there's a big change. And in the 1970s, which is not long after Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in America, which again was civil rights, not human rights, we have in the 1970s the beginning of two great battles for human rights in countries which are not your own country. One of them, as we said before, was the anti-apartheid, which was around Nelson Mandela. The other one was freeing Soviet Jewry, which was around in particular Natan Sharansky, although it was also the Soviet Democratic Movement. And both of those movements involved using the issues of human rights in order to argue against the way countries were mistreating their own citizens. Both of those battles lasted for a long time. The Soviet Jewry struggle took from the 1970s until 1989 to achieve its success. It was only in 1986, 87 that Natan Sharansky was released from 12 years in prison. It was only in 1990 that Nelson Mandela was released from 22 or 27? 27 years in prison. These are long-term struggles, and they only happened because there were international movements that put pressure. One of the important moments was in 1975, when the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to have the Helsinki Accords. And the Helsinki Accords in 1975 said, on one hand, that countries should not interfere in the internal affairs of the other. But the other half of the Helsinki Accord, all countries should respect human rights. And then, even though the countries were not interested in pushing human rights, we began to have a grassroots, massive movement for that. The success of the Soviet Jewry movement and the success of the movement, the anti-apartheid movement, both of them created a totally new attitude in the West that said that human rights is actionable, that it's a political program, that it's not just a nice sermon, but that could really have an effect on international politics. Now, part of that had to do with the Cold War. In the 1980s, when Soviet Jewry movement in the United States went to Ronald Reagan and said, Ronald Reagan, we want you, as the President of the United States, to put pressure on the Soviets to release the Jews who are in prison there, who are in jail there, or who can't leave, then Reagan said, yes, I believe in that. I believe that the Soviet Union is the wicked axis, the evil empire. If I want to present America as right and Soviet Union as evil, this is a good case for me, because I can show that they're violating human rights, and therefore they don't have a right to continue in their regime. And therefore, every time Ronald Reagan met with Gorbachev or earlier met with Brezhnev, he always started the meeting by saying, I have a list here of the following 30 people who are Jewish refuseniks who are in prison for no reason other than because they want to leave the country. Are you going to help me with this? And gradually what happened was the Soviets, in order to get better economic relationships with America, they began to release more and more Jews. There were ups and there were downs. And in the end, in 1989, finally, all of that structure collapsed. The Soviet Union stopped being a communist country, and 2 million Soviet Jews could leave. It started as the human rights of a few people who were refuseniks, and it turned into 2 million. And of course, with Nelson Mandela, it was a whole country that gained their human rights and their political rights at that time. By the way, 1970s is also the time of another great struggle for human rights. Ugh, I hate to say that. The United Nations passed the resolution that Zionism is racism. This was an idea of the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union got the African states to support it, and of course the communist states and the Arab states that are well known for human rights, all of them to say that Zionism is racism. This is the same Soviet Union who, maybe for better reasons, used to say that America is racist, and they presented the treatment of African Americans. Human rights became a very important tool in the battles between countries. We're still in that situation today. Human rights can be used in order to argue for the individual human rights, and human rights can be used as a political tool in order to attack a whole country and say all of Israel is racist, or Israel's treatment of Gaza is war crimes that violate human rights. So it's not enough just to wave the flag of human rights. You have to ask how it gets used politically. If you want to be effective, the Soviet Jewry movement, you're going to have to use politics to turn human rights into a powerful political force. But once politics and human rights are combined, they also get misused in terrible ways. So, for example, today in the United States, one of the movements for human rights and civil rights is the movement called Black Lives Matter. And it has to do with the fact that so many blacks in the United States end up going to prison for very long periods of time, that blacks get killed by the police. If you would like to join the movement that Black Lives Matter, as many Jews on college campuses in the United States would like to do, you also have to sign on to the platform of Black Lives Matter, which says that Israel is a racist state. So sometimes these human rights battles can be used and manipulated in all kinds of ways that we need to be afraid of and careful with. Now, there's one other interesting way in which human rights has become a much more powerful force. Its great triumph, if you will. The notion of humanitarian wars. To go to war to stop inhumanity. Where did they do that in Europe? In Yugoslavia. When Yugoslavia fell apart, and you had Serbians who were persecuting and also executing Muslims in Kosovo, then the United States and all of the European countries began to bomb Serbia to stop them from the continuation of their genocide of Muslims and their massive rape of Muslims. And now some of those Serbian political and military leaders are being judged in the international court for crimes against humanity. And when there was trouble in Libya, then one of the arguments for Obama to drop bombs in Libya was he wanted to intervene for human rights. He also said he would intervene in Syria when the Syrians were using chemical warfare. He didn't do it in the end, and a lot of people complain about that. Again, we're back to the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans in Syria. But human rights has become a very powerful force in international politics. But today, I'll only refer to it, we don't have time to discuss it. Today, human rights issues are in a terrible crisis because we have a different kind of problem of human rights than we've ever had before. It's not the problem of violating the freedom of conscience and religion of individuals like Nelson Mandela or Nathan Sharansky. Today, as we mentioned before, it's millions and millions of economic refugees, not political refugees, economic refugees who are coming out of the Middle East and coming out of Africa and spreading throughout the Western world. In 2006, there were something like 8 million refugees in the world. In 2016, there were something like 16 million refugees. Those are refugees who left their country. And then you have many, many more refugees who had to leave parts of their country and move to other parts, like in Syria. About 1 million of those refugees got to Europe. They were welcome in Europe. And now we can see some of the results. As I mentioned, is a reaction moving all of politics in Europe to the right, to a nationalist, self-protective point of view, partly because many people felt that they were stretching their societies too far by taking in these refugees, not just temporarily, but turning them into citizens to be supported with all of the rights and values and economic support that comes. So there's a tremendous crisis. Of course, this crisis is in Israel as well, right? So I brought you, if you look at some of the pictures that we have here, you can see it on page 3. Here you have just a picture to remind you, these are Syrian refugees in Greece today. In fact, I just met a group of Israelis who are spending Pesach in Greece, working with Syrian refugees as a volunteer project. On the bottom, you have the protests by some of the African refugees, economic refugees, remember, not political, who are living in Israel, and there's a threat now of the Israelis to want to deport them to Africa, back to Africa, for all kinds of complex reasons that we'd have to discuss. But those issues are the biggest issues. And we'll come back to that if we have any time, which we probably won't at the very end. Let's now go to the second revolution of the United Nations, the one that I mentioned before, the one that has to do with the move from, the move from negative freedom to positive freedom. So, if you will, take a look at, yes, it's on page 5. You see there's a very big B. And can I ask you again, Donnie, to be our reader? Donnie was also kind enough to make sure that this was translated into Portuguese. He'd like to thank Google, but I'd like to thank him because you can never trust Google translations. Okay, could you read in B and number 1, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the other really important person involved in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights?
Não só liberdades negativas de interferência na vida privada, mas os meios econômicos e sociais para desfrutar as liberdades positivas, para desenvolver as capacidades e a autoexpressão de alguém. Eleanor Roosevelt promoveu os direitos econômicos propostos pelo presidente Franklin Roosevelt no famoso discurso de 4 liberdades, The State of the Union, 1941. que incluiu a liberdade do medo e da vontade, que requer recursos materiais. A liberdade sem pão tem pouco significado. Meu marido sempre disse que a liberdade da vontade e a liberdade da agressão eram duas liberdades que tinham que acompanhar. Na década de 30...
That's good enough. Thank you very much. So again, this is referring back to Roosevelt's speech in 1941, and it's making the issue of freedom from want, freedom from not having basic needs covered. It was the basis in America for the first time to begin to create Social Security and job insurance, unemployment insurance, which England and some of the other countries brought that in, especially after World War II. And it becomes part of the goals of the Allies, which is to supply basic economic and social needs. So I want you to see what they listed as rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which are economic rights. So take a look at the first page again. Look at number 22. And if you, Donnie, could read 22 to 26.
Artigo 22. Todo ser humano, como membro da sociedade, tem direito à segurança social, dos direitos econômicos, sociais e culturais indispensáveis à sua dignidade e ao livre desenvolvimento da sua personalidade. Artigo 23, parágrafo 1º. Toda pessoa tem direito ao trabalho. Parágrafo 3º. Todo ser humano que trabalha tem direito a uma remuneração justa e satisfatória que lhe assegure, assim como à sua família, uma existência compatível com a dignidade humana e a que se acrescentarão, se necessário, outros meios de proteção social. Artigo 24. Todo ser humano tem direito a repouso e lazer, inclusive a limitação razoável das horas de trabalho e a férias remuneradas periódicas. Artigo 25, parágrafo 1º. Todo ser humano tem direito a um padrão de vida capaz de assegurar-lhe e à sua família saúde e bem-estar, inclusive alimentação, vestuário, habitação, cuidados médicos e os serviços sociais indispensáveis, e direito à segurança em caso de desemprego, doença, invalidez, viuvez, velhice ou outros casos de perda dos meios de subsistência em circunstâncias fora de seu controle. Artigo 26. Todos têm direito à educação. A educação deve ser direcionada ao pleno desenvolvimento da personalidade humana e ao fortalecimento do respeito pelos direitos humanos e pelas liberdades fundamentais.
Thank you very much. Now, each one of these rights, we can find very easily Jewish sources for these ideas. I'm not saying that Jewish sources directly affected some of these, but I want to try to show the way in which we need to emphasize those aspects of Jewish tradition which support some of these larger notions of human rights. I also think that some of the Jewish ideas can also help us to understand in a deeper way these United Nations ideals. Let's start with the last one, education. When in the West did they begin with the notion of universal education? When did every child get an education as part of their duty and their right? It only begins in the middle of the 19th century, about 200 years ago. But in Jewish tradition, at least for boys, not for girls, we weren't egalitarian, but Jews have been educating their children for a long time, but not just educating their own children, collecting money so they could pay for the children whose parents couldn't pay for their education. So the principle that education, it's not just that education is good for getting a job. It's that education is essential for being a human being, for expressing yourself, for growing, for flourishing, for self-expression. So that's one really important principle, education as part of human dignity. The second principle we see in number 24 is about rest. How many of you have a paid vacation? Okay. How many days of paid vacation do you have? Somebody want to give me an example? 30. In his case, that's true, right? But it's not true for you. Why? Because Rav Michel is only counting the days when he has vacation. He's not counting Shabbat and Sunday, because you work on Shabbat and Sunday. But you probably don't work on Shabbat and Sunday unless you're a rabbi too. So actually it's 30 days, and for other normal human beings, it's every weekend you have 2 days off. Who was the first one in the world to come up with the idea that every single week you have 1 day off in which you cannot work and you don't have to work? Shabbat. Now, I don't think I ever fully understood how special that was until I read an article about ancient economies. And it said that Babylonian economy, Egyptian economy, Greek economy, which all had very high civilizations. They had priests, they had writers, they had jurists, they had philosophers. How could they have those activities? Only because they had a class of people who had the leisure time to study, to think, to write, to read plays and dance. How did they have a leisure class? Because 80% of the people, or 90% of the people, or 95% of the people had to work how long? How many days a week? They didn't have a week. There were no weeks before Shabbat was created. Because what's different between day number 7 and day number 8 and day number... You worked all the time. Right? It's religions that introduced certain festival days when you wouldn't have to work. But it's the Jews who introduced that every single week created the notion. The Jews gave the world the weekend. That's one of our great gifts to the world. Now notice, it's a gift because it's universal. It's for every member of the society. That's what's really radical about it. Right? In fact, Shimon Peres, I think, explains it very beautifully. If on page 5, could you read, Donnie, where it says Shimon Peres near the bottom of page 5.
Primeiro-ministro Shimon Peres. Shabat é diferente de todos os outros dias da semana. Não tem atividades de rotina, nenhum compromisso de trabalho, nenhuma interferência por parte das autoridades, nenhuma tentação do mal. Por um dia por semana, o homem é totalmente gratuito. É, livre. O mandamento para santificar Shabat, algumas coisas passam. O mandamento para santificar o Shabat foi o primeiro chamado para a humanidade em geral para a igualdade real. E a primeira convocação para libertar o homem da escravidão do homem, para libertar o homem de si mesmo, da rotina de trabalho. Este foi o primeiro gosto significativo de liberdade e igualdade. E esse gosto nunca desapareceu desde então.
Notice that Shabbat has something to do with the notion of a human being. The notion is that if you live in a society in which you're always working and other people are never working, you will not think that you're equal to those people. You might not even think you're in the same category as those two different kind of people. But if on Shabbat, as it says in the Torah, the purpose of Shabbat is that if you have slaves, the slave should rest just like the master, then the difference between the slave and the master is relativized. It disappears 1 day a week. And it reminds you that all human beings are created equal. Now, we all know that there are rich and poor people. Certainly people in Brazil know that. And you know the quality of existence is radically different if you have wealth or you don't have wealth. But at least 1 day a week is a day in which no master can tell you what to do, and you are equal to everybody else. And so it plants the idea of equality and the idea of freedom, even as a society which hasn't yet achieved that completely. And that's part of one of the radical notions of Shabbat. There's other radical notions. The notion of social security, that everybody, in case you get sick or you lose your job, who's going to support you in Jewish tradition? If you lose your job, if you're sick, first your family and then your community. And everybody in the community has to pay into the tzedakah, and the tzedakah gives poor a right to support. It's not charity. It's not love. It's not compassion. It is a right, which is part of the notion of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It's changing the notion of helping people from charity into tzedakah because they have a right to it. Now, of course, they only have a right to it because other people have a duty to make the contribution. And you also have a duty to make the contribution. And your duty to make that contribution is that in rabbinic tradition, everybody has to give tzedakah. Even the people who receive tzedakah have to give tzedakah. And you say, well, why? The community gives money to a poor person and then asks the poor person to give a certain percentage back to the community? How inefficient. But I think what they're trying to say is that people who have a duty to help one another are people who have dignity. A person who cannot make a contribution is a person who doesn't have dignity. I think that's a really powerful notion. Let me give you an example of that. In Israel, of course, you have a draft for the Israeli army. And in the draft, you're only drafted if you are physically fit. If you're a cripple in one way, if you're disabled in one way or another, you don't get drafted into the army. But if you want to be a member of Israeli society in good standing, if you want to be a person who's a dignified Israeli, then what do you have to do? You have to serve in the army. So there were a whole series of protests. At the end of those protests, the Israeli government and the Israeli army said that anybody, even if you're disabled, who wants to volunteer for the Israeli army can volunteer. Now, that's a complicated decision. It's, of course, much more difficult and expensive for the army to provide jobs and support for a person who is in a wheelchair. The person can make a contribution, but the army has to have a whole logistics to be able to take in people with different disabilities. But that's now the standard in Israel, so that everybody who wants to can volunteer for the army and enter the army and make their contribution, and that's the source of dignity. So notice, human dignity is not just the right to receive support, it's the right to give. And that's one of the rights that's mentioned here, is the right to a job. It's very different to have the right to a job than the right to a handout of money. And so Maimonides, of course, is famous for that. The highest level of tzedakah, you all know, is to give a person a loan, to give a person a job, or to invest in somebody's company. A poor man comes to you and says, I have a great entrepreneurial ideal. You say, okay, I'll invest in you, and I hope that you'll succeed. That's a high form of tzedakah. We hardly call that tzedakah. We call it an investment. Or if I give a loan to a person and the loan will be paid back, that's not tzedakah. But for Maimonides, it's the highest form of tzedakah because it gives dignity to the recipient. One of the tzedakot that our family gives a little bit of money to is called the Israel Free Loan Society, which was created in 1990 to give loans to Jews from Ethiopia, to Russian Jews, to people who had needs. And the interesting thing there is that they lend out the money to people who, if they went to the bank would say, we cannot lend you any money. Why? You have a bad credit rating. What does the word credit mean? Credit means belief, credo, to believe in somebody. We don't believe that you'll ever give the money back, and we're not lending you money. The Israel Free Loan Society says, we're going to lend you money. We're not going to charge you any interest. We're going to help you develop a business plan so you can pay the money back. We believe that you can take this money and turn yourself into a more independent being and return the money. So by giving people the credit they don't deserve, that is, they don't deserve from a bank's point of view, by giving people that trust, you're giving them their dignity. So that's part of this. I think that's part of the ways in which Jewish thought has thought a lot about the ideals of the United Nations, and they've already turned it into a part of the institution of Jewish organizations of tzedakah of one form or another. Let me mention one other example of that, and that is the right to have a family. Do you know any social welfare system in which you can go to the social welfare to the state and say, I would like to get married. Can the state provide me the money I need to get married? Now, what does it mean to get married? You have to be able to rent a house. You have to be able to have a bed and sheets and linens and cooking materials. Well, that's the basic notion of rabbinic tzedakah, is that we have to find people, we have to give people the resources to get married. Because you cannot have human fulfillment if you don't have relationships. It's being lonely which is the worst part of it. In fact, that's one of the core basic Jewish understandings. As God said about Adam, it is not good for a human being to be alone. I will create a partner for the human being. The notion that human rights is not about the individual's rights, but about the individual's ability to enter into a family, to enter into a community, to become a productive member of a community, that's really what gives dignity and meaning to life more than anything else. So I don't know if you have it in your city or not, but have you ever heard of J-date? What is J-date? Can you explain that in Portuguese? Right. So J-date is a Jewish tzedakah. According to the rabbis, if you see somebody who's having a hard time finding a friend, a lover, a spouse, then it's a mitzvah for you to try to be a matchmaker. That's also part of human dignity. They don't have that in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, right? But they do have the notion of the importance of family. But to translate the ideal into a reality, we'd have to help people to find the partners they need. Sometimes the needs are not economic. So let me end with the following statement and see if there's any questions. I would like to give a very short critique of what I think is wrong with the human rights movement. Number one, what's wrong with the human rights movement is, for the most part, they emphasize rights and not duties. That's the biggest problem. If the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights would be equally about rights and equally about duties, then we could talk about it. But very often we say human rights are rights that belong to all human beings anywhere in the world, but we don't talk about, so who's supposed to supply? Who has a duty to supply those human beings? And we don't talk about it enough. And I think the stronger we would emphasize duty, including the duty of the immigrants who receive the support, right? The sooner I think that people would appreciate and be willing to grant human rights, because many people say human rights is just an excuse for the poor people to be parasites on the rich people who feel guilty because they have the money. When in fact, it should be the creating of solidarity in which people give to one another whatever they have to give, because everybody has something to give to the total pot, to the total value. That's principle number one. It's important for us to go back to the notion of mitzvah. I don't know about Brazil, but in the United States, to talk about a mitzvah, a commandment, something you have to do, is not at all popular in American culture, including in American Jewish culture. They don't talk that way. You have an obligation. But I think we need to go back to the education of ourselves and of our children and our grandchildren to obligations, to duties that are correlative and correlate with rights. The second thing is, there are no human rights without human power. Many people who are liberals on the human rights say, who hurts human rights? Any state, any organization with power always is power exploiting human beings. If we want human rights, we have to get rid of all states, all political organizations, or in the famous song Imagine, right, from John Lennon, right, we have to get rid of nations, of classes, of religions, and then the world will be a wonderful place where there are no identities and no states and no organizations. But whenever I look in the world and I see a place where power has collapsed, Syria, or Afghanistan, or Libya, or parts of Nigeria, then I say those are the worst places. There are no human rights when there is no government. And so I think we need to find a way to talk about the value of power as well as the limits of power, and then we can have human rights. And the last thing is that I think very often when people talk about rights, they talk about them as, if you play bridge, a trump card. How do you translate that into Portuguese? No. That is, a right is, if it's a right, you have to give human beings, because it's a human right, and how could you not give that right? You are violating human dignity if you don't give those rights. But in fact, I think what rights are very often is right is a certain need you have, but it's not an absolute right. So when an African refugee comes from Eritrea and he comes from Sudan and the economic situation in his country is terrible and he comes to Israel or he comes to Italy, or I don't think he gets to Brazil very often, but maybe, right? From Venezuela, okay. When they come and they say, we have a human right. And I say to them, yes, you do have a human right, but no right is absolute. As Hillel used to say, and I think he summed it up for me, Im einani li mili. If I don't worry about myself, who will? But if I don't worry about others, who am I? The point is we need to balance between our own rights to our own culture and our own community and taking care of our own poor people against the rights and the needs of people from outside our societies who are refugees, economic refugees. The problem in Israel is, where have the 60,000 refugees from Sudan and Eritrea ended up living? They ended up living in southern Tel Aviv, where the immigrants from African Asian countries of the 1950s who never made it in Israel suddenly are overrun with the refugees of the 2000s. So the question is always going to be, how do we balance? Where is our concern for humanity and where is our concern for our own community? And I don't think that the answer should be either or, but there has to be balanced. And to say this is a human rights violation, I don't think that helps us to deal with the real problems and questions of balancing between our needs and our ability to help other people. Thank you very, very much.
Noam Zion, toda rabá. Amanhã ele estará na comunidade Shalom, às 19h30, falando sobre os 70 anos de Israel, todas as questões relacionadas à disputa do Kotel, a conversões, a direitos das comunidades judaicas, religiosas, igualitárias, inclusivas, movimento reformista, movimento conservador em Israel. Quais outros temas, Adriano? Tensão entre religião e Estado, amanhã, 19h30, na comunidade Shalom, e Noam Zion volta no dia 20 de março na comunidade Shalom e 21 de março aqui na CIP para ensinar a gente a usar a Haggadah, para fazer do nosso Seder um momento mais significativo para os diferentes públicos que nós possamos ter na nossa casa, fazer com que o Seder seja mais instigativo e que nós possamos... instigante, né? Instigativo acabei de inventar, instigante, e que a gente possa aproveitar partes diferentes da Haggadah, porque a Haggadah é de uma tal forma que não dá para você ler tudo e usar tudo. Mas se você sabe como usar essa ferramenta, o Seder pode ser a cada ano um Seder novo e bastante interessante. Mais uma vez, obrigado a todos. Temos o prazer de te entregar 2 pequenos mimos, presentes. Os rabinos da CIP escreveram sobre a Parashá da semana e a Parashá foi ilustrada pela Rosália Lerner. Agora você tem alguma coisa pequena para colocar na mala de volta para Israel. יש לך משהו קטן להכניס למזוודה בחזרה לארץ. תודה רבה, אנחנו מודים לך.